All right. Excellent. You all should hear that. That's kind of the fair warning that everything's being recorded. And so that'll get uploaded to our cloud. That way you don't have to worry about any data management. I'll just be able to share a link with you all afterwards in case there were any details. Can everybody hear me okay on your end?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm huddled up in my basement. Just got done doing all kinds of stuff today. Been a little busy. I ripped apart my lab after class yesterday, and then I had to put it back together before my students showed up this afternoon. And then we were able to get into our hives because the weather finally broke. So it's been a very full day, very exciting. So Susan and I were talking about some interesting things and wanted to see what you all wanted to talk about. And so I have to warn you, I only have 2 college courses worth of material and 7 years worth of different extension things on this one computer. So maybe we'll try and stay a little more focused than that. I have to warn my students that at times I might ask people to try and drink out of a fire hose, but that's really just because I'm very excited, and I'm excited to have, basically a captive audience to talk about bees. And not only that, people who know about bees or are starting their journey on bees or have somewhere on the spectrum of where they are in their beekeeping. So it's very exciting, and thank you again. What we kind of settled on was a little bit of everything, and trying to think of how I should start this. One way that's kind of interesting to me is to realize that we have had challenges in Virginia in the past in keeping our bees. There are jokes to be made talking about bee havers versus beekeepers, and those aren't necessarily out of kindness. But one of the main issues is over a 13-year period, we were losing about 40% of our hives. And from somebody who's worked on a farm or two, or worked with farmers or two, I could tell you that if I went down the road from where you are now and talk to somebody who's getting ready to plant some soybeans here in a few months probably, and say, hey, I got this brand new deal. You're only going to lose around 40% of your yield. Where would you like to sign up? I'm pretty sure that I would be escorted off of their property very quickly. But somehow as beekeepers, maybe it's because we're optimists or maybe because we're stubborn, we decide that we can live with that. And I think we all know that we can make up those losses pretty quick, but if we only have 1 or 2 hives, that can hit kind of hard. That's close to half. So my goal is to be able to help people have a better idea of how we can work with our hives, work with the colony cycle and use that to our advantage, how we can get on top of what's going on with pest management, and ideally begin to curve down, flatten the curve of that overwintering loss. And so some of what I'm going to be talking about today is part of that. And then I'm probably going to raise more questions than answers. And I think that's a good thing. And to tell you the truth, I'm also going to be headed to your area for something else. So first, we talked about coming together and doing a cool dissection workshop. This is something I do with my students in lab and something I was able to debut with folks at the Virginia State Beekeepers Association meeting last year. Just gets into some of the insect physiology aspect that you might not normally have access to. I don't know how many people sit there and look through a microscope on a regular basis, but if we can get our bees under there, we can really understand a little bit more about what's going on inside their bodies and how that can dictate how they work as colonies, as a group of individuals. And then I will also be coming to your area, and I need to set this up in the next month to share with you some of the material that you're seeing today, but in a 3-hour workshop. So I've been working my way through Virginia. I think I got 7 different regions that I worked through. I wrote a grant and there were 7 regions, and then the VSBA picked up to 13. So now that makes my math a little bit difficult, but 7 different regions with 346 different participants. No, excuse me. Yeah, 346 different participants so far in a Don't Let Varroa Crash You workshop. So I'll be reaching out to you all and asking you all to come participate in that. And I'm going to give you all kinds of helpful material, both physical and intellectual, in hopes that we can improve some of our pest management. So those are my 2 plugs for now. And I'll share some more information about that at the end. But I'm happy to answer questions. We can wait till the end if you would like. I'm not sure how many people we have online right now, but we got 16 online. So you can flag me down if you need to, raise a hand or something like that on the Zoom chat, and we can get to it. And if we decide that we need to focus on something else, I do have a couple other presentations pulled up that we can borrow from to answer some more specific questions. Does that sound like that'll work for folks? Okay, great. And just to give you an idea, you're about this big on my computer screen right now. So audio will be better than like a thumbs up. Apologies for those of you there in person.
All right, and we'll yell next time too.
Okay, great. I can hear that. I can hear that. Okay. So
Yeah.
when I think about what's going on inside the hive or why we are getting into the hive, I really think about evidence. And I am finding myself trying to encourage this for my students now more. These students have no science background, no beekeeping background other than what they're learning in my class the day before. And so I'm telling them, hey, when we go into the hive, we need to go into the hive for a reason because we are basically invading an entire society. But when we go in, we can gain information. So we need to think about that. Some general things that we can see when we go inside a hive. And I know we're getting back to the basics here a little bit. Don't worry, we'll build upon it. We can think about what's going on in terms of measures of colony health. We can really get down to it and think about the various number of things we want to be managing for throughout the year. So I'll skip this for now since I'm not there in person, but some of the things we can think about are equipment condition. You know, just walk up to a hive. You can see, are there bees coming out of the back of it where they shouldn't be? Can you see a little bit of mold where maybe you had a feeder on there and it was leaking a little bit? Is it leaning the wrong way, or did, like one day for me, did the outer cover blow off about 40 feet down the field because it was really windy up here in the mountains? These are some basic things about equipment. When we're going in, we can figure out what's going on with the queen pretty quickly. One of the things I'm encouraging my students to think about today is if we can find eggs, then we don't have to find that queen. Yeah, more on that in a little while. We can evaluate what's going on with brood production, think about their food provisioning, and their population levels. All of these are general things that we're kind of building up. We might not have written it down, although perhaps we should have, but these are things that are building up in the back of our head, giving us this overall impression of the hive. And these are all useful things to think about in terms of management. We want to make sure that we are on top of where the colony needs to be, and then additionally anticipating the needs of the colony in hopes that we can help them be better prepared for what's coming next. So sometimes people ask me, hey, we need to diagnose something. We need to figure out what's going on. A lot of times I'll get a call, hey, I've got a dead out, or this happened. And people have all kinds of things. I don't know whoever put it on the internet that when a bee twitches, it means that it's been poisoned by pesticides. Things just twitch sometimes. That's not necessarily it. But there are some interesting things we can learn. So people ask me for help, and I hope you can pick up, there's a little bit of humor here, that wax moth killed my hive. Wax moth is, well, we'll get into that later a little bit. We'll talk about this. Flies killed my hive. I'm sorry, what was that? No, couldn't.
We're good. Keep going.
You're good. All right, great. Well, hopefully you're giggling a little bit. All right. Another one is flies killed my hive. I actually got somebody from a county, not your county, don't worry, had requested federal support for losing their hives, and they sent me pictures where they thought that there were flies that had killed their hives. And in fact, I found that there were filth-feeding flies, phorids, that had completed their entire life cycle in the hive. So my recommendation was that no, that person had not actually been there and managing bees quite some time, so much so that filth feeders were able to come in and invade what was left over from my dead out and basically take advantage of it. My background was in forensic entomology for my master's, so you can't sneak a flyby on me. Another one is yellow jackets killed my hive. I like to blame yellow jackets for a lot, and I do have a trap out right now so they don't sting my kids. Maybe I can get those queens, but they're not going to kill a hive. That's not exactly how that's going to work, unless they were to break through from underground because you put one right on top of a nest, and even still, they might be able to get along. Hornets killed my hive. This used to be kind of funny, and I think I still have it in here that I'll share one thing with you, but now this is getting a little more important. You all may have heard of the giant Asian hornet. People in the news love to call it the murder hornet. It has not been convicted of murder in North America. And as entomologists, we try to be a little more specific with our terminology, and this one is the giant Asian hornet. It does not occur in Virginia. It does not occur in the East Coast or east of Mississippi or east of the Rockies. And actually, it was only really found in Washington. There were one or two nests, and they were pretty well destroyed. And there's actually some very cool videos about how they would hunt them. And that means that all of my buddies were texting me pictures of the cool X-Files suits that those people were wearing to go in and go after these things. And they were saying, James, you got to get a suit like that. But nobody offered to buy me a suit like that. Instead, though, we do now, we, as in the East Coast, has the yellow-legged hornet. And we'll be putting out some information about that before too long. This is an invasive that has been found in Savannah, Georgia. That's it, just Savannah, Georgia. And it is capable of doing an activity called bee hawking. So the video I'll show you later on shows something where there's an attack in mass, and that's the Asian hornet, but the yellow-legged hornet does bee hawking. So picture a returning worker getting picked off one by one. You know, if there's a very large nest nearby, that could be a problem, but it's not going to take out a whole colony. For me, I would think it'd be another thing we'd want to put up there on the list of things we don't want around when we have virgin queens that need to get mated, right up there with dragonflies and log truss. Neither one of those are really going to work out very well if they encounter a virgin queen returning from her nuptial flight. So more details on that in the future. Nothing right now, but I still get calls about it. One of my favorites, and I think you all get a snow or used to get snow, was it snowed 3 inches in Virginia Beach one time. And somebody told me that had killed their hive. And I think I did a very good job keeping composure, knowing that I've had to walk through about a foot of snow to make sure my entrances were open so my bees could go to the bathroom, since they had all 6 of their legs crossed waiting to get out. But in this case, the guy before the snow had seen bees coming in and out of his hive. And then after the snow was concerned about it and went to check it out and found out that, in fact, he no longer had a hive. So for me, I usually think that this is one of those things where we chalk up robbing activity or other bees visiting and coming out and slowly robbing during the winter for colony activity. So this time of year, if you haven't gotten in all your hives, please get into all your hives on a nice day. But prior to this time of year, you could think about looking for pollen coming in and out of your hive or going into your hive. That's a good sign that you have brood production and a good sign that things are good if you don't have the chance to go in and inspect your hive. But I had a hard time digging up some sympathy for them. So these are real examples. I don't think they're necessarily all real problems, but they certainly leave us suspicious about some things. So let's go into it. We're going to talk about bee and hive-based evidence. That's going to get into equipment, adult population, brood population. We're going to get into stores, just some general things there. Pest-based evidence, including wax moths, small hive beetles, varroa mites, wasps, mice, and my new current favorite that I have to deal with, bears. But then I'm going to jump into totally different directions for you all to try and come up with some things. When we're thinking about equipment, how drafty is too drafty? Well, a healthy population will show you, because there will be all kinds of propolis wherever you didn't think was good. I usually don't worry about it too much unless my equipment is just really, really drafty. If I have multiple entrances all over the place, I'm less worried about there being a specific draft and more worried about the kind of work that those bees would have to do to be able to guard all of those entrances. That sounds like a lot of work, sounds taxing. Doesn't sound like I'm being a very good landlord. We can think about moisture control issues. I usually think, because I don't live on level ground, I think of my hives all being tipped forward so they can drain nicely and things like that. I have one right now in the back of my head that's leaning slightly backwards that I'll need to tweak this next week. And then when you have a good apiary site, moisture controls really shouldn't be, or moisture shouldn't be much of an issue. We want to make sure that we have good air drainage, that we have a wind break, and that when we go up in the morning and it's nice and cool and it's kind of a foggy morning, we don't want our hives to be the last thing in the fog. That gives us an idea that there's a bunch of cool, damp air kind of settling around. There's this nice idyllic place on our research farm where everybody says, you should put bees down there. And I look at it and I go, man, that's really pretty. There's a creek running right along the back where I'd be able to put my bees. And every time I go in there early in the morning, that's where the fog still lies. I'm not trying to grow chalk brood. I'm trying to grow bees. So if we think about that ahead of time, we can deal with moisture control. What about a bunch of burr comb? That could be a sign that maybe you got your brands of 8 frames mixed up. That appears to be my problem right now. But it could be that there's some equipment issues that could be adding an extra tax to your bees. Unprotected comb can be a challenge. Right now, we could be supering, we could be doing all kinds of other things, but if we put more equipment on than our colonies can handle, then we might be giving more refuge to stuff like black moth and small hive beetle. And then that'll make more problems for us down the road. And then entrance reducer. I used to be all over this, and then things got a lot less typical for winters. And so I've been a little more relaxed about this recently, and that's just kind of a personal thing. For me, I was looking to make sure the mice were out, and then I was looking to make sure that my colonies were strong, and then wanted to make sure that if I had too many bees in one bee yard, that I could sort of direct their traffic to be a little more friendly next door. And then tight spaces. Since I've had some delightful experiences with small hive beetle, I am no longer a fan of any tight spaces that bees can't get to. And so you might be thinking, what on earth is that? Well, if you put on that rabbited edge inside of your hive, one of these nice frame dividers that makes sure your frames never slide and keeps them perfectly spaced, you'll find that there's a little gap in between. And so if one small hive beetle got in there, let's call her a female, she is capable of laying about 3,000 eggs in her lifetime, and that can end up being a problem. So I get rid of all that. I make sure that my bees can propolize whatever they need to, and I just bring a good sturdy hive tool and make sure my equipment is sound. Our adult bee population can tell us a lot, and this is one of the things I'm dealing with right now. I now have a record high for me. I offered a third lab now, and so I've got 31 students over 3 different days, and they each partner up to take on a hive. So now I've got quite a few bees in one bee yard where I'm teaching absolute newbies about beekeeping. And I have an embarrassment of riches where my colonies are a little too strong. So I'm making some very early splits because I'm noticing that my hives are too strong for them. What I want to do is kind of gauge what's going on with the population. And if I were just to assess what was going on inside the hive, just looking at it, I could tell. So I found myself today talking through a split or talking through the reason for supering and things like that. If you just look, you can see there's bees up on top of the frames. There's all kinds of room. There's all kinds of activity. We can see that it's a good, healthy population. It's not like we had to kind of peer around in between the frames to see if there was anybody there up in our supers. Instead, it was nice and active. So it gives us a good idea of what's going on. We can see what's going on with health. If all our bees look lethargic, if they're hairless, if they look like they are worn a little ragged, that would be kind of tough right now. Maybe we have some hives that are dealing with some nosema infections and things like that, where there's some extra overwintering stresses that they haven't quite shaken off yet. We would probably see those kinds of symptoms inside the hive because they just wouldn't look as good as we would hope. And I know that's very subjective, but we do encourage people to keep 2 hives or more instead of just 1 hive. That way you can sort of have a comparison. You can see what hopefully is 1 good example versus a bad example, or 2 fantastic examples. That would be excellent. And then from there, you get to deal with your own embarrassment of riches of having too many bees because you have to split to keep them from swarming. That's different. You want to make sure your bees are active on warm days. And then how do you gauge defensiveness? This is not a brag, but my students get it kind of shocked that I usually work bees without my gloves. I'm 6'7" and my hands are proportionately large. So if I put on big gloves from there, I'm probably smashing a lot of bees. So part of my feedback is to watch what's going on inside the hive and be very gentle. It keeps me calm. Hopefully I can keep the bees calm. So the test I show them for testing a defensive reaction is I kind of slowly wave my hand over top of an open comb. If we have a whole hive body open, if I wave my hand over and it's met with all kinds of bees and they're inviting me to leave from the hive, that gives me an idea that something might be going on. Sorry, I've come up with some new ways to talk about getting the bee Jesus stung out of me. But it's my own fault for going in without gloves. So we can get an idea of what's going on there. I would bet that a queenless hive would be a lot more open to inviting me to leave the hive than a queen right hive that has plenty of other work to do. So we can get a good idea of what's going on. What can we tell about the queen based on our current population? Well, let's look at it. I've been thinking a lot more about timing recently. And in fact, some of you may have seen my talk that I gave in Virginia Beach called Bee Math, really trying to contextualize some of these things. It takes 21 days to make a bee. So we go from egg to adult, 21 days. So if I see a strong population now, I can go backwards 3 weeks and I can see, okay, well, the weather was a little weird 3 weeks ago, but these bees are big. There's a big colony in here. That gives me an idea. I can go backwards in time, gives me an idea of how they've been performing in the past to set them up for their success now. It gives me a pretty good idea what's going on. The challenge is when you start getting into your bees too often and making some management decisions and not writing them down or making some mistakes, then you can kind of mess up the whole time frame. Like when I borrowed some brood from one hive, and it turns out I also borrowed the queen. But we figured that out today. So let's look at our brood population. Really want to see where we are. And this, of course, depends on what time of year and what the colony cycle is. We want to have eggs when it's time to have eggs. When we're looking at hunkering down and it being the early stages of a very cold winter, we don't want to have a great amount of production. But if we have the luxury of being able to produce a bunch of bees, let's go for it. Pop quiz, is the example on screen a good brood pattern, a poor brood pattern, or where's the pattern?
What pattern?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. What pattern? This is pretty close to what we would call a shop brood pattern. And I'm coming down from my high blood pressure last week where I had American foul brood samples out to show the students. And so this has got me thinking about that shop brood pattern. Very not good, not what we want to see at all. So we want to go in and assess things. We want to take an idea of what we can see inside the brood. And I know it's March Madness, and actually my alma mater has both women's and men's teams now in the Final Four. First time since I was in the womb, so I'm excited about that. But if we think about the brood nest as being like a basketball, if we were to try and examine what's going on in the brood, and I take the outermost slice of the basketball, I would probably not get the full story of what's going on inside there. However, if I were to slice right down the middle and then open up the two halves of the brood nest, then I would expect to be able to figure out most of what's going on. And so when we're looking to analyze our brood nest and analyze our brood pattern, we want to make sure that we work our way through to get to that middle to get a better idea of what's going on. In the spring, we know that we can have some pretty tough cycles of weather. Like it was a beautiful day today. And then Thursday, I had to tell my students, I'm not going to let them in the hives if it's snowing because it'll be 44, 40 something. I probably won't get in the hives at all. That's okay. We'll set up swarm traps instead. So that can have an impact of what's going on inside our brood nest. You know, we have a lot of stressors from that where if our bees make too much brood too soon, they brood up too quickly, then they might not be able to get a hold of all the resources they need, or they might quickly burn through those resources. And that can impact what that brood nest looks like. Because if they have to condense so much that they end up chilling some brood, then we can see a decay and a clean out and some spotty patterns from there. So usually I start to think that when they get into a second brood box, things like that, we expect to have a pretty clear idea of what's going on in the pattern. And hopefully things will be pretty evident from there. So we want a good amount of eggs, preferably one in each cell. Right now, if we find 6 in one cell or they're randomly put on the side because somebody's abdomen is too short, that's going to tell us something significantly different about our queen. Probably being a laying worker, which is actually a misnomer. It's probably not one worker. It's probably a group of workers. So we want to have a nice distribution across our brood where we can see eggs, young larvae, older larvae, capped brood, pollen, a little bit of everything. And it'll give us a good idea. The best description I've ever heard of a nice brood pattern was wall-to-wall carpet, because capped brood ends up being this nice cocoon that ends up looking like carpet, and just having a huge, nice pattern is great. Really helps me out. One thing I have found in trying to explain this is my students and the average beekeeper have all seen Shrek, the movie Shrek. Does that sound familiar? Anybody seen the movie Shrek? Yeah. Okay, so if we're looking at a brood pattern, well, our brood is kind of like Shrek. Donkey tells Shrek that he's complicated. He has layers like an onion. And that's exactly how I want to think of my brood nest. I want to see these concentric circles going through my brood pattern to where I can see older to young to young to youngest. And on that very perimeter is where I would anticipate finding my eggs. And then very likely next to it is either the last stage, capped, getting ready to emerge out, or right next door, brood food, which is going to be pollen. So these concentric layers give me an idea. And often when you pull out that middle frame on the top box of brood, you'll see it looks like half of a basketball, because the other half is in the next box below. All these concentric circles showing us what's going on backwards in time, 21 days at a time. So what kind of provisions do we have? We want to make sure that we have fresh pollen, especially when there's a chance to get fresh pollen. We want to see bee bread. We want to see that they're not using all their pollen. They're not starving. I like it when I start telling students something about like, oh yeah, I expect to find a wall of pollen. and then I'll find my brood nest on the other side of it. So you look at one side of the frame, it's got some pollen in it, and then you flip it over, and it is literally a wall of pollen. That to me is a pretty clear definition of, hey, we're going to have brood beyond here. Interior to that, that's where we're going to have tons of brood. That just makes me happy. And then I like to see a nice variety and all kinds of things. We still have dead nettle blooming right now. And so people are like, why is there red stuff coming in? And it's a lot of fun to see. So we can see we'll be dripping with nectar. That's excellent. I like it when that happens. Things get nice and messy. We'll have cap honey, which will be helpful. Whitening everywhere. That gives us a different idea about provisions. If you haven't picked up on, the whitening is really that these bees are making a whole bunch of wax in anticipation that there's a bunch of nectar coming in. So then we need to think about capitalizing on that supering. It could be a good idea to be able to get them to draw some foundation and put some of that good stuff to work. That's the opposite of seeing bare shelves. We don't want to run our hives so hard that they have no provisions, because we'll have weird cold snaps. Or things will dry up. We want our bees to be able to ride that out. And then we can have dark caps on our honey, just nothing but dark caps. That to me tells me that that colony didn't go through a bunch of resources, wasn't very active, and we need to kind of keep an eye on it. Maybe it's getting a little too mature, and we can think about some better things we can do with it to reinvigorate it and getting it moving in an active direction instead of just standing still over time. And it can be a challenge. And, you see that dark honey one time, you're like, I don't feel like messing with that during this extraction. If it's there year after year, then we can really think about what it might be soaking up from the environment. Everybody with me so far? Sound good?
Yeah.
Great. I'm just drinking water. I'm still catching up from being in lab all day. And that's not necessarily my drink of choice right now, but that's okay. So let's talk about it. First one was, hey, maybe wax moth killed my hive. Well, wax moth killed this equipment. You'll find some interesting things. They can lay eggs on or near comb, and they can lay quite a few eggs. And then they'll hatch out in a few days. They migrate to the comb. They tunnel through the comb, which is disgusting, pooping all over the place. One of the big giveaways for me is a lot of webbing. I would expect to find this in an abandoned hive. There might be a tiny little brood nest way underneath this in a bad situation. But that would probably be if I had 6 boxes on top and only bees in the very bottom. But I really wouldn't expect them in the bottom in that case. So they're going to move out of the comb and they're going to pupate. And if it wasn't gross enough for them to eat and poop and do everything else inside the hive, this is where it gets really gross and really interesting. If we look over here in this section, you can tell where they have actually scraped out a little bit of the sidewall here to be able to pupate. And so they actually can incorporate that. So you can kind of see where people are recycling some things because it's been sitting around too much when you have those kind of claw marks that are really from the pupae. So the adults emerge and they're a big, beautiful, ugly, grayish mass of the wasp, and it's kind of gross. It gives you a good idea of how you quickly catch one with a hive tool and makes you feel a little bit better. There are technically parasitoids of this. So there are little wasps that will then sting the cocoons, and then they'll, instead of an adult coming out, you'll end up with more wasps coming out. And that's cool unless you have windows in your shed, and then you've got both wax moth adults and random wasps hanging out here that do nothing. Like a lot of parasitoids we can see in our Lepidopteran, our caterpillar pests, the damage is done by the caterpillar already at that point. So the parasitoid doesn't necessarily help us out. So I wouldn't exactly go buy those off of Better Homes and Gardens or whatever. You might be able to get those. So some things you can do. It's not going to kill a colony. It might be the last straw. Maybe your colony would abscond, basically give up on you and leave afterwards. So that you can store comb, you want to protect it. You could think about fumigating it. I'm seeing some stuff where folks are using things like acetic acid. Please be careful when we're using volatile organic compounds. They're not safe for our lungs. You can use para-dichlorobenzene crystals, PDB. You'll commonly find this as paramoth. These are moth crystals. These are not moth balls. Moth balls are actually naphthalene, and that will kill our bees too. The moth crystals will wear out over time and won't be deadly to the bees to put them on the same equipment. Please do not treat your hives while they're actively hives with moth crystals either. And then there's some non-chemical controls. If you're worried about this, if you have that big, beautiful frame that you want to be able to get to the state fair, freeze it first, and that'll be able to knock out these eggs, and they won't be able to develop from there. So freezing temperatures, and you can store them in lighted areas. Usually if I have too many dead outs and I put them all in one corner kind of thing, and it's one of those, I'll get back to it later, like in the delightful winter of 17-18, where I pulled all but one hive out of an apiary. That's where you're going to end up having huge issues with wax moth. So really it's more of a matter of neglect and a nuisance pest than what we would call a primary pest actively attacking our hives. Small hive beetle, however, is a different kind of jerk. So small hive beetles are delightfully armored. They can protect themselves pretty well from bees. They do some nasty habits like actually beg for food from bees. Bees can corral them, and then there's not really a good answer on how to get rid of them. They're capable of surviving in the wild, so it's not like we can eradicate them. And the agricultural entomologist in me thinks, man, if I could just keep them from getting into the hive, then we'd really be doing something. But there's no current major control efforts like that right now. A lot of people will say, oh, well, I can just drench the soil around my hive with a soil drench. And you can go and buy this. I think the pyrethroid insecticide that you would use is called Gold Star or something like that. And you can buy it from Data Ant or Man Lake or whatever you like. And you can drench the same kind of chemicals that can kill your bees around your bees and then hope it works out well. But the only thing you would kill would be the beetle pupae. So they pupate in the soil where they go hide out. So that means the damage is done already. So same thing. You could say, well, maybe we'll go for some of these nematodes. And these entomopathogenic nematodes, they'll eat insects. Don't sprinkle that in the hive because bees are still insects. But if you sprinkle that around the hive, drench it in, then they can survive in the soil, and then hopefully they'll be able to attack those pupae. But then again, the damage has already been done there. So it is from Africa. The joke is wait until you see the large hive beetle. It is very large. We don't have that, and it will, because of its size, I don't think it'll be an issue getting into North America. So it does something similar, except for small hive beetle brings a friend. So we already talked about wax moth tunneling through and doing some gross stuff. The friend that hive beetle does or brings with them is actually a yeast. It's symbiotic only to the beetle. And so if you've ever opened up a frame and seen it slimed or smelled a citrusy smell, that is the activity of the yeast fermenting that honey. Once that's happened, the bees will not return to that honey. It's done. And so I think some of these really late season swarms that we're hearing about, like into September and stuff like that, might be sort of where we top out in our small hive beetle populations inside the hive, and our bees just get up and leave. They abscond. So it's not good when we get to that point. Kind of a challenge. So some things you can do. Small hive beetle is not going to warm itself up during the winter. So that means it's going to be clustering and trying to gain heat from our overwintering clusters. So when I think about early spring management opportunities, that's when I think about being able to use traps and stuff like that to try and trap them out. And then hopefully you could reduce them. And it might not sound like much. Let's see, if I spent $2 on a hive beetle trap and I caught 10 adults, it's not an even sex ratio. It could be something like 6 females to 4 males. But if each one of those 6 females is capable of laying 3,000 eggs, that's probably worth $1.50 to me. Now, is it worth it dumping oil every time you move that hive body around? Maybe not. You can go get a different color duct tape and put it on the outside of your hive, on that hive body, just to let you know if you got that kind of trap. Help you think about it ahead of time instead of making a mess. Yep. So I went to the Colony Loss Prevention Task Force on small hive beetle years ago before the pandemic to get some interesting stuff and learn more about small hive beetle, see what we could do. And interestingly enough, it gets to be kind of a political area where some people might not admit that they have small hive beetle because it's yet another invasive. It could look like a failure in quarantine and things like that. So in this case, in Brazil, that was what the issue was. It was politically not there. So if we look down at the bottom here, we could see that these are basically just nestling around in the detritus, the decaying material in the bottom of our hive. We look, it looks like this hive probably got robbed out, or maybe they absconded, all kinds of interesting things going on. So when I see this just makes me want to clean every bottom board I ever had. But yeah, that's not good at all. That's a tremendous amount of beetle larvae there. and they are quite capable of moving around, but they're not going to go back up and reinfest the hive. These are pretty mature. They're getting ready to go migrate from the hive to go pupate. Not good when we see that many. So some things you could use. You can come up with another cool name for beetle, jails, blasters, barns, all these other things. Most of these are going to be some type of trap that's going to catch them. The beetle be gone sheets, like you can see here in the picture, we put over top of one section of the brood nest where we anticipate that colony kind of clustering. The bees are going to rip that stuff up, and it's going to make it more likely to catch the beetles. Yes, you can find dead bees in there. I've never found a queen in there. I've found 1 or 2 dead bees in an entire sheet where I've found 6, a dozen beetles. So I think that's pretty much worth it. And they come and they're pretty cheap in the pack. You just staple into it. The worst thing about this is the staples. Well, why would I put a staple? Well, otherwise the bees would pull it out of their hive. They'd get rid of it. They'd be successful at removing it. So we staple it to the top bars and then try and remember to bring a pair of pliers with you, or bother to pull it out with your hive tool afterwards, just so it doesn't catch you when it breaks and rip open your fingers. So there's some new traps in development. Please, 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 only follow the label. Only use things that are designed and licensed to kill small hive beetles. I have in the past heard people getting so frustrated with small hive beetles, and this is an election year, they would take the corrugated plastic from things like political signs, and they would introduce an ant bait in there. That is an off-label application. Also, beetles are in the order Coleoptera. They are not in the order Hymenoptera. That specific product works in ants in the order Hymenoptera. Our bees are also in the insect order Hymenoptera. And the active ingredient in that can get inside honey and then have bad effects for humans. So none of that is what we want to see. It can be frustrating. If you need something satisfying to do with small hive beetles, I recommend that you use a standard American hive tool. It's got that nice 90-degree at the bottom. Take that flat part, and when you rock it against a hive beetle in a flat place, it makes a delightful crunch and lets you know that that one has been 100% controlled.
Yes, it does.
What's that?
No, we're enjoying the thought of squishing hot beetles. My biggest problem is they run faster than I sometimes apply. Yeah. The tool.
They do, and they could see my thumb coming. So today, I was kind of with the corner of my hive tool, just quick nipping them off to somebody's frame. Well, I'm just, oh, this is a hive beetle. Oh, I've never seen one of those. Crunch. And it kind of kept going. I think I only got 7 out of one student's hive before they got 1. So at least they have now killed 1. But if 5 of those were females, that's 15,000 eggs we could have prevented. That seems like it's worth the effort. All right, so I promised you a video. Please, 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 I'm on the record. This is not in North America. This doesn't happen, but this is also very cool. So people are worried about the hornets thing. They're worried about what's going on with the hornets. This is an example from National Geographic where the Asian honeybee and the giant Asian hornet coexist and co-evolve. But it's also kind of a neat video. I don't know. I guess a peace sign. Sometimes Zoom gets too smart for me.
Checks and balances.
You all hear this?
Place for payback. These two are honeybees. They made their hive in a hollow tree. They too are caring for their young.
This is
But
likely
these are
Apis
native
cerana.
Japanese honeybees, and they're not quite as defenseless as their European cousins. They have evolved a secret weapon against the giant hornet. One they may need often in this deadly season. This hornet is the advance guard of an attack force the bees could never withstand. But this time, the bees set a trap. They want the hornet inside. And the hornet obliges. The scout's main task is to mark the hive with the telltale pheromone so that her sisters can find it later. But the native honeybees know her game. By swinging their abdomens to and fro, they signal their strategy to one another. The bees hold off until the last possible moment. And then, as if of one mind, they swarm. The hornet is engulfed by hundreds of bees.
And they did the ball back. Ball.
Don't sting the intruder. Instead, as revealed by thermal photography, they all begin to vibrate, gradually raising their collective temperature to 117 degrees Fahrenheit. Japanese honeybees can tolerate a temperature of 118 degrees. Their victim's opinion is 115. The hornet scout is slowly roasted alive.
Well, flash warning. Sorry about that. Okay. So in North America, we do not have a hornet that does this. This is what a lot of people really feared. We do not have a hornet that does this. I think the populations that were in Washington are now gone. They were actually imported by some folks endemic to that area to be able to eat them. It seems like kind of a dangerous snack, but not what we have going on. The wasp that we currently are worried about is that yellow-legged hornet, and it doesn't do that at all. Instead, it would just eat one adult bee at a time. So yellow jackets, one adult bee at a time. They're not that smart. They're not going to figure that stuff out. So mice, that was kind of a weird thing to show you. I thought it was just kind of fun though. And I had to be careful about my time. How are we doing on time today? Do we have a target where we wanted to end? I was also answering a quick question in the chat about diatomaceous earth. I'll let you think about that and we'll see where we can go next. So mice, I'm sure you all have dealt with them. What we don't want is we don't want a large amount of area and then have a clustering hive just way up at the top and nothing going on down here at the bottom, because then mice can get in. So there's specific excluders for that, like the expanded metal ones that are kind of drilled holes in metal, or you could use an entrance reducer, or just keep a boatload of bees and they'll drive them out of there. But it is not pleasant to smell mouse urine anyway, much less inside your hive, and they'll definitely destroy some equipment and make you not want to have anything to do with the honey from there. Bears, those aren't fun either. This is halfway through 2 attacks. I have since then had a 3rd attack in this apiary. Coming in what I think is the end of my 3rd cooling off period. And I had the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources came out, and we sort of talked about some of the problems and showed them what was going on with the hives and things like that in areas we've had in the past. This is from years ago. We've since then done more. And I told them I wanted to make a fence so hot that we end up with bear fricassee kind of thing, but that's not going to happen. We had some management issues between the farm's management that they need to do for themselves and mine. They maintain about 30 plus miles of fence, and all I needed was this little area inside here. So we're going to probably move the apiary around, get it a little less enclosed by the woods, and then we'll probably have a separate fence that I'll run off of my own solar stuff, and I'll be in charge of it. And then I don't have to worry about somebody taking it down for maintenance unless it's me. So that can be a bit of a challenge here. Okay. The swarms nearby aren't great. You can try and recapture them. I did knock one swarm, air quotes here, out of a tree. I pulled several different queens out of there. I rehoused them, put them as swarms, in new equipment in a different apiary. And I think I only had one that bothered sticking around. They're not happy about it. If you see that your bees are up in the air and annoyed and things like that when you come in, before you even get there and they're not swarming, I would check the perimeter of your fencing, and I would also look for scat and things like that. It could be a sign that something happened to your fence and the bear has started to explore, and that'd be a good time to really double down. Make sure you've got that low wire to the ground that doesn't have impedance, doesn't have weeds or a limb from the storm before on it. Grounding it out. Make sure your grounding rods are strong. Make sure that you don't have a bunch of oxidation around your wiring, and then that you are fully charged. That bear is going to get a hold of that fence before it gets into your bee yard, and if it gets the right shock, it will not come back. It won't kill the bear. It won't kill you. but it will certainly create a shock that's going to make it look for food elsewhere. And then, yeah, you might use all of your adult words. If you're not careful with that. Yeah. You can come up with a Fort Knox, and I think I'll be working with Department of Wildlife Resources to come up with a joint fact sheet on this. They've got some fun things where you can electrify a single hive. So to touch the hive at all, it'll get fried. You can also put an unwelcome mat. And picture some nasty stuff where there's spikes coming up out of the ground. You can actually electrify that if you need to. If you're dealing with that level of it, think about a potential relocation site. Think about some other options. Don't want to be out there and have to encounter a bear on your own. All right. So Mike said, I'm doing okay on time. And we're going to switch gears now. Now, that was some of the basic stuff we were talking about in what we can see inside the hive. Please don't mail me dead bees. I can't do anything with that. And tell my students, and they're worried I'm getting hate mail, and I know that's not the case. We used to do some tests, and I think people picked up in the habit of doing tests for this, where we would look at dead bees and we would dissect them, and we would look inside the trachea and we would look for tracheal mites. And that was the main reason we would be able to do something with dead bees. I'm a beekeeping person. I don't do research on viruses. I don't do research on individual pesticides and things like that. My job is to really get out to the public and do some interesting things. So I can't do much with most of the samples. If you have something you feel like is a pesticide kill, please call the pesticide hotline. You can just Google Virginia pesticide hotline. That'll take you to the number that'll get a hold of VDAX. VDAX will send out an inspector. They will begin to document stuff, and then the process starts from there. I can't do anything for you other than that. In terms of disease samples and things like that, call your local inspector, or you could submit samples to the USDA, the Beltsville lab, and then they can get access, or they can give you some information back. But there's likely going to be a serious amount of time holding that off. The USDA stopped checking for tracheal mites more than 10 years ago. And I think it's because of this graph I have pulled up here. This is from the BM4 partnership. This was 13 years of data here. I have to figure out what's happening to their data now that they have gone bankrupt. But what we can see is the beekeepers in Virginia were losing, on average, about 40% of their hives. That's a large number. That's that only coming out with 6 when you went in with 10 kind of number. And that's not good. And so if these colonies are getting knocked down so quickly, then it's no wonder that things like tracheal mite wouldn't be able to build back up. So it's a secondary mite, and the diseases aren't anywhere near the same. And it may still exist out there somewhere in pockets, but it's not a pest. It's not really on my radar right now at all. I've never even seen one, and I've dissected a number of bees looking for them. Just to give you an idea of what's going on with the numbers here, that was 6,000 responses for backyard beekeepers. That's a total of 34,545 hives. And so losing 40% of those, that's a significant cost. That's something we don't need to incur. And I would say that over time, that is not something we can sustain. So it's not sustainable. So I hope that we can help out and we can talk about this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about things that lead us into the winter, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about mites, if that works for everybody. So we talk about, okay, great. So some basic things. Our bees store honey. We steal some. Hopefully we're just stealing the excess. We're not being greedy beekeepers. And then our bees can get through on the rest. So I tell my students that in the summer, the bees work themselves to death. They live 30 to 35 days. That's a race car bee. It's just going and going and going until it's done. In the winter, however, those bees last 3 to 7 months, and those are our station wagon bees. They pack the lunch, they're physiologically young, and they're in it for the long haul. So let's tuck that one away. Let's think about that one. That is the bee I'm really thinking about when I'm thinking about overwintering survival for a number of reasons. They also stop rearing brood in some cases. I think I had 1 or 2 colonies that decided they didn't want to mess with that this year. And I was really crossing my fingers until I sampled them today, and they had no mites. I was still impressed with that. And then they form a winter cluster. So they don't heat the whole hive, no central AC, central AC, but no central heat. And they just heat themselves up. That might not be a big deal when they're just doing their early winter temperatures because they've suspended their brood rearing. But when they start keeping the brood nest or have to keep the brood nest over 90 degrees, 93 degrees, that is energetically very expensive. So that's where we need to make sure that we have plenty of honey available for them. And then ironically, in this picture, you're not seeing the evidence of cleansing flights. You can tell somebody opened up this hive and just randomly distributed some bees and they landed in the cold. But you want to make sure there's room for cleansing flights. And my equipment looks better than this now. Don't worry. The cleansing flights allow them to get out and use the bathroom. Just think, if you had to sit there through this meeting, having to use the bathroom the whole time, what would happen? You would get a little cranky and this, that, and this. But if you had to deal with it time and time and time and time and time again, then your bacteria in your body would begin to do some nasty things. And so that can happen. There can be some challenges to the immune system, very helpful in the winter and the rest of the year, if these bees can't get out and go to the bathroom. Probably not an issue. We haven't had any. I can still remember the last good snow we had up here, and that was 2013, Valentine's Day. We got like 18 inches. Biggest snow day we ever had. It was a ton of fun, especially someone who grew up at the beach. But I have not had to reliably go out and make sure that my colonies were uncovered. So that's good. So storage of food, we typically save around 50 pounds of honey. That can get them through it. I'll show you some numbers here in a minute. So if you don't have that, you can feed your bees. You can give them a 2-to-1 sugar solution. A 2-to-1 sugar solution is going to be very nutrient dense. It's the highest form of carbohydrate we can get inside there. And you basically have to boil the water to get this to go into solution. Those bees will treat that like honey, which means you want to be careful. Maybe you can mark it on your frames or something like that. The empty frames where they put that stuff away, you're not going to want to extract it later. That is not the best stuff in the world, but what it is fuel for when they cluster. And you can get them through there. So if you start some late splits, if you have some other weird things going on where you can't get enough honey on during the flow, this is something that can help you get your bees through the winter. So then they also need pollen. So hopefully 3 to 5 frames of pollen. Typically when I start to think about those bees kind of moving up, you'll see that those bottom boxes will have a lot of pollen in there. If you want to encourage pollen hoarding, one thing you can do is another reversal. So if you shove a whole bunch of open brood right by the entrance, all those returning foragers end up getting a dose of brood pheromone that encourages them to go out and collect and hoard pollen. So that could be one way to do that. If you're not careful, though, that might instead put the foot on the accelerator and make them make a bunch of bees. But that might not be a bad thing. So this protein will be helpful for winter brood rearing. In my case, my last bloom is typically something like goldenrod. And we'll see that wrap up in September. By the time we get to October, we'll start getting killing frosts. And they won't see anything new again in earnest until late February. That's a long time, a long time. So we want to make sure that they have plenty to get in there. You can feed pollen supplements, and I'll show you some data on that here in a minute. So in early fall management, you really want to think about strength, and then you want to think about what's going on in the winter. We'll talk more about that. So we want to make sure there's a decent number of bees. We want to have some better, I'll get some newer pictures of these, but you want to have a good strong colony going into the winter. And I'll show you why here in a minute. Sorry, there we go. We say we generally want around 30,000, more than 30,000 bees. They can actually utilize fuel more efficiently. And if we have weak colonies, we can combine them. How do you combine a bunch of bees? Well, you can shove a bunch of newspaper on top of the queenless colony, put your queen right colony on top once you've made some slits in there. It allows the two smells to mingle, so it's not a World War III kind of situation. And then the queen right colony will take over. If you do this in the fall, it's kind of what some of us talk about is taking our overwintering losses in the fall. So you knew you had 2 colonies that weren't going to make it. Now you have 1 colony that will. Then you've lost 1. But it keeps you from having to do a whole bunch of extra equipment stuff, and it's not necessarily the worst. So in general, we're thinking about 2 full-depth hive bodies. But you can overwinter smaller if you like. These are the data, and I find this interesting because this is ultimately counterintuitive to me. So let's walk through it. This is an older study. It's from 1968. We can see that the number of pounds of honey, and yes, that is before Varroa, the number of pounds of honey consumed per 1,000 bees, and then the number of 1,000 bees per colony in autumn. So a colony of 10,000 bees consume around 25 pounds. Okay, the recommendation was 50, so all right. A colony of 30,000 bees would only consume 1 more pound. So you're telling me if you had 20,000 more mouths to feed, only 1 more pound of honey would be consumed. That is weird. So I've come up with a couple of different ways to think about this. If I were to go, and my neighbor adopts a lot of dogs, if I were to go walk two dogs and I'd have a big one and a little one on a winter day, which one would get cold first? The big one or the little one? Assuming the big one's not a Great Dane.
Little one.
The little one. The little one will get cold, no matter how furry it is. Although my little one's actually just short, not little, but pretty furry. So that dog would lose heat more quickly than that large dog. This is a matter of surface area to volume ratio. The exact same thing can be said for a cluster of honeybees. So the smaller cluster would lose heat more quickly than the larger cluster of bees. And because of that energetic savings of have 20,000 more bees, the cost in terms of fuel is only 1 more pound. So we want to shove as many healthy bees into the winter as we possibly can. So that was old. Let's look at new. Coming out in 2019, we can look, a study out of Penn State said this is a survivability curve where you have a 100% chance of surviving versus you're dead down here at 0, based on weight. So the weight was a proxy for measuring how much honey in there. And they said, all right, fine, let's look at all these other things. In October, going into the winter, if we have a big, heavy hive, it's going to do just fine. And what they found was that they did a bunch of interesting things. One was, there's some reputations for some bees up in the mountains of Pennsylvania, and they're the best bees ever. They said, fine, bring them down here. And there were bees that did that, bees that did this, left-handed bees, right-handed bees, every which way. As long as they had their disease under control and didn't have varroa issues, the only other indicator for their success was going to be a large population going into the colony or going into the winter. And so as long as they took care of that, that was it. That's pretty new. That's pretty quick. They also, in this paper, it's kind of interesting if you need something that might put you to sleep when you try and read this. They went and looked at varroa-resistant bees and said that perhaps they should instead call those varroa-tolerant, because that matches up more of how we would think of it in a botanical sense. You might be thinking about what kind of seeds you're going to get right now, like those tomato varieties. They're likely resistant ones that would never have a disease, or tolerant ones that might be able to survive in the presence of a disease. But that gets into a little nuanced about varroa mites. So can you get small colonies for the winter? Yes, you can, but plan on being able and ready to feed them. The most tragic story I've ever had was me getting all excited about this nucleus colony, shoving in a pollen patty, letting it explode, and then not having enough fuel for it. It was basically one weekend I couldn't get out there and give them more fuel, and so they all froze to death because they ran out of fuel. What a waste of bees, what a waste of equipment and effort. So they will not have as much honey, they will not have as much bees, they will use more fuel. So then think about being able to get them more fuel. It's just part of what your management stuff is. You can think about it ahead of time, then you can plan for it. If you have a tough road to get to your apiary, having to make more winter visits might not be one of your higher priorities, so you might consider a different management strategy. Then I have this thing I've been thinking about called free heat. Whenever I set up an apiary, I want to get my bees facing the right direction to make sure I can get as much free heat as possible. So if my hives get nice early morning exposure to full sun because they're southeast facing, they are getting full. And that is a direct savings in honey, because otherwise they would have to burn honey to then be able to get their flight muscles warm enough to then go out and fly and then take advantage of stuff. We actually see this difference in shaded apiaries versus not shaded apiaries, where there is a cost savings for those not shaded. In our areas and in Virginia in general, although maybe not in the 757 in some cases, it's usually going to be a better trade-off over the course of the year than having it in the shade. So it really helps out. And if our bees are up earlier, then they're active earlier, the nutrient rewards are actually better. Pollen is more nutritious earlier in the morning because it hasn't dried out, done a bunch of other things. So let's look. I thought it was kind of neat to be able to show you those bees super cooking that hornet. And that's kind of what goes on here. They can really crank up their heat through vibrating their flight muscles and keep the cluster warm. So this is what a cluster looks like. We look inside here. Here's a nice big queen. The brighter the color, the hotter the temperature. And so we can see the center of the brood or of the nest here ends up being very, very warm. So then we can look and see that the outside is not very warm at all. So it's not as though these bees get put in timeout for the whole winter and they have to just ride it out like something out of Game of Thrones on the wall over there Instead, these bees can cycle in and out and boil and, sometimes take a break and things like that. If you were to open up your colony while a cluster like this is going on, they take on two interesting defensive things. One of them I call the porcupine. So if you crack it open, it's too cold. The bees are too cold to fly. So what do to defend themselves? They put their stingers out and wait for you to run into it. But then, like something out of a sci-fi movie, these bees inside are super hot. Their wings are warm enough, their wing muscles are warm enough to come fly. Those are the ones that will come out and actively uninvite you from the hive. So kind of interesting how the cluster works. We can measure the thoracic temperatures, the part that the wings and the muscles or the legs come out of, and we can see that they need to be pretty warm so they don't chill. And with on the outside of the cluster, these bees will be pretty close to that temperature. So they'll be about as razor thin of a margin as we would be able to see. So Tom Seeley did some interesting work, and he looked at this and he said, fine, okay, what part of the hive is heated up? So we can see that on colder temperatures, that the cluster ends up being very warm in the center and then not that warm on the outside. And so really what's going on here is they are not heating up the whole hive. They're just heating up that cluster. And then from the Beekeepers Handbook, I believe it is, I like this because it's just a nice thermometer going on over here. We can see the different activities of what happens with the ambient temperature outside. And so if the bee just lands somewhere and it's 40 degrees, then it'll pretty much die on its own. That's why we saw dead bees in the snow. But we can see that the brood rearing is going to stop if it gets down to 40, and some interesting things happen here with clustering. Yeah, leave it there. And so this is kind of what that cluster looks like. This one's actually boiling over. It was kept a little warm for a little while. Maybe they were enjoying the radiant heat of the inspection that day. But people often ask me, and this one gets a little complex. This is a USDA document. Might not explain that right now. So yeah, let's look at the outside. Let's see how much heat's going on out here. So if you take some pictures at night, when the sun's not bouncing off your hives, you can get an idea of how warm it is. So a student said they wanted to do that, and a colleague of mine says, hey, can I take some pictures of your hives? I said, sure. So down here, we can see very hot, very warm. We're going to end up having a nice warm group of bees. And this is what it looks like without using that infrared. So let's look at it again. A nice warm spot of bees and then nothing going on up here. Can anybody tell me what this weird line is going through the middle of my hive? Right here.
Inner cover.
It's my inner cover because I'm feeding these bees. So it's not, this is not on a very cold day, but you can see it's nice and warm here and they're clustered up. There's no honey for them to go get. So I'm feeding them right here on top inside of a pail. And some people will see this and say, wow, how can you put sugar syrup on top? And my thought is, well, if the bees are cold, and they need to get some fuel. What I don't need them to do is be able to go find moisture anywhere, then come and lick up something solid, then dissolve it, and then be able to feed it to the other bees. Because where is moisture if not in the hive? And maybe it's in the water. So they have to go outside, and they have to be warm enough to use the energy to go outside and then find water that's not frozen, then bring it back to the hive and then be able to dissolve the sugar. So I cut all that stuff out and I feed them sugar syrup. And I have a document I can share with you afterwards if you'd like to know more about that. So people say, well, what about the freezing temperatures and all these other things? Well, at a 2-to-1 sugar syrup solution, it takes 12 degrees to be able to begin to freeze a 2-to-1 sugar syrup solution. And inside of an outer cover, like I have here in this picture, we're not going to be getting down to 12 degrees, not unless it's real hard cold for a real long time, in which case it's not going to freeze the same way as a normal water would, because it's 2 parts sugar to 1 part water. So more on that in a minute. So then the next thing is, well, shouldn't I wrap my hives? So if we insulate our hives, it does a couple interesting things. So Santa Claus brought me one of these, the Saturday Night Live calls them big dumb cups. One of these insulated cups here, and it does 2 interesting things. If I put something cold in here, it sort of feels like it stays cold, but in reality, it's not gaining heat or from the environment as quickly. So I put something hot in here, it's like it stays hot, but in reality, it's cooling, but not losing heat as quickly as it could. And that's what the insulation does. So if I were to wrap a hive with insulation, it would do the same thing. So that means when we get that nice warm day after a snow, then my colony would heat up much more slowly and wouldn't be able to take advantage of flight times to be able to go out and go to the bathroom. And we're wrapping the whole hive. really it's the cluster that's the thermal unit inside here. So it slows temperature changes, and to that, it could be a negative effect. And some people say, well, fine, maybe I'll just use tar paper. Well, that's great. It'll get really warm very quickly. I would venture to say that with our winters that we have been having being so cyclical and so different from one year to the next, that you'd probably be more likely to cook your hive and make them need to go cool themselves than you would being able to get a significant heat advantage from having them wrapped. So in Virginia, we don't recommend wrapping hives. I do know that there's some interesting plastic hives that are coming out with all kinds of interesting things. I don't have experience with those. So yeah, I can try and find some papers on that if you really need them. So warming is a good thing. Get your bees that free heat, they can do something with it, and they can go out and they can break that cluster, they can go use the bathroom, they can maybe be a little bit nicer than having to cuddle up next to their sisters with a full bladder, and they can deal with it and get better from there. So how do you feed? I've told you I like to feed sugar syrup. Right now I've got pails on and these in-hive hive top feeders, mainly because I had too many bees in an apiary when there wasn't enough stuff coming in. So they're pretty much using all that stuff up, and we'll see if we need it again. I want to make sure that they were going to be able to get through these last couple of winter cold snaps. I have some old pictures of glass jars and things like that. And having swept up a bunch of glass jars, I don't use those anymore. I get some of these buckets. They make smaller ones that go inside of a nucleus colony. They make bigger ones that go inside of a regular 10 frame, or they fit the 8 frames. And you'll see, I commonly put an inner cover down, and then I'll make myself a very magical scientific tool. I've got some white pine trees near my apiary. I break off 3 branches smaller than my pinky, so a little more than the width of a bee, and make myself a tripod. Then the bees can get up underneath it. And I've poked little holes, same kind of nails you'd use for a frame inside there, invert this feeder, and they can draw from it instead of it just pouring out. Then you cover it up from there. I did notice pricing out hives this last week to share with my students that they will throw in a Boardman entrance feeder with it. So we don't recommend that because a number of reasons. First, it's exposed to the elements, so it'll be as cold as the ambient temperature. And so things can happen from there. Second, it's on the entrance. So if we look at this one picture here, if these bees need a whole bunch of food and it's very cold, those bees are going to be clustered pretty high up, looking where there's going to be fuel. And they've been burning through the fuel as they get higher and higher and higher. So they're going to be up here. If it's so cold that they need a bunch of fuel, their food is all the way down here. So then who is taking advantage of this fuel? The strong colony next door that is plenty warm and has enough energy to go out and get stuff. So then why would they stop there once they get into the front entrance? It can encourage things like robbing. We don't make a recommendation. A lot of people say, oh, well, when I start packages or when I start nukes and things like that, if I can drive by my bees and see where they need feeding. Okay, sure. Go for it from there. That's a totally different kind of scenario than being able to walk away from it for an extended period of time in the winter. You can use division boards. It's not fun when you find a small hive beetle in there doing the backstroke, but it can get food closer to your bees. My one thought is that it could be a sink of heat over time if you weren't careful. So maybe you could think about putting this on the south side of your hive so it gets warmer quicker. I don't know. I have some different ideas of that. I've got a shelf full of these. I use them sometimes I don't. I have to look into it. So we can also give our bees pollen. So if you feed them spring in the pollen, feed them pollen in the spring, you can see a couple of things happen. So if we look here, this square over time is our trend of bees, the mean cumulative number of workers reared over time from the 19th of March to the 26th of April, if they were given pollen patty. Here we can see the control where they did nothing. And here we can see where they did the opposite and stole pollen from them and they were limited. So the take home is, over this period of time, if you were to take pollen away, you would have a negative effect. They would only rear about 5,000 workers. If you did nothing, it might not matter at all. They got close to 15,000 workers. But if you gave them a little bit of pollen early, it would get them all the way up to 25,000 workers. And then by the end of April, that's when we should be seeing the flow and we'd get some good stuff going on from there. So something to consider if you want to push them, but keep in mind that when you're pushing them and they're making all those bees, that they also need to have the carbohydrate resources to be able to keep themselves warm. So you might have to feed 2 different ways. or make sure they have plenty of honey on. All right, other things to think about for the winter. Got to have a good queen. If you don't have a good queen, then you end up with a weird frat party where there's nothing but drones and their sisters having to take care of them. And then that gets to be kind of a mess. And that's not fun. So then you want to protect them from climatic extremes. Make sure they're not going to blow over in some hard winter winds. You don't want them just having a cooling effect or just getting nothing but exposed to cooled winds. So you can protect individual hives. You can use ratchet straps. You can put all kinds of bricks on them and things like that. Want to make sure they have plenty of honey and pollen. And then you want to maintain them in a disease and parasite-free condition. Well, no hives in North America are parasite-free. What we can do is we can treat our bees when we break threshold and we can kill the mites. If we do that, we can knock down what's going on there. What we can't do is kill all the mites, unfortunately. And if they were fed upon by mites over a serious period of time, a treatment will not fix that. And we can't treat away the diseases once we treat those mites. So there's a lot of things going on there. If you all can bear with me for a little bit, I can sort of tease this out for you. And I feel like this is that 40% overwintering loss. We're not generally greedy beekeepers just stealing all their honey. I mean, maybe you know some people who are, but I haven't met them yet, or they haven't admitted it at least. We usually make sure they have a queen, although every now and then we want some drone layers and that gets weird. And most of those other things are kind of taken care of, but the condition of our colony gets interesting over time. So this is what we've always said, we being, people like me who talk about bees, where the recommended time to treat a colony was early fall. And the thought was, well, it's that time, we're going to make winter bees. They should probably be healthy. Let me go ahead and treat. And I'm here to tell you that if you wait until then, that old train of thought will leave you at the station. It will have left long ago because that disease doesn't go away. So you need to think about being proactive in your management to prevent your bees from getting diseased. The diseases are there. Things like deformed wing virus are just naturally in our hives. But in the presence of feeding from or high pressure from varroa mites, we can see a synergistic effect where they get much worse in what's going on. So there's no good time to have that. And what I've been asking people is, let's pretend that we are livestock managers, that we have a herd of cattle. Let's ask ourselves, okay, if I knew about it, when would be, or how many head of cattle would it be okay for me to let get sick? So let's do some higher order math here. How many head of cattle would it be okay for me to let get sick? Any thoughts? None. Okay, great. So how many hives would it be okay for me to let get diseased before winter? None. It's still going to happen. I'm sorry, it's still going to happen. The diseases are there. But what we don't want to do is let that disease level get so high they can have long downstream effects on our colony. Because what's really going on is the management we're doing right now is for this year's honey season and next year's honey season. I'm doing overwintering management right now by making sure that I'm doing whatever I can to keep those disease levels low so I can have a healthier colony longer. So some of the other issues, we're switching gears. We're talking about varroa mites. Let's get back on varroa mites because, well, they're the bane of my existence. They're likely the bane of your existence. And if you tell me your hive dies, I can probably tell you that we'd have to jump through some serious hoops to claim it was anything other than varroa mites. They are that big of a problem. So let's talk about how bad of a problem they are. Let me show you this one video, and then I'm going to get on a soapbox, even though I'm seated, and we're really going to talk about what's going on with the biology because that helps me understand what's going on there. Were you all, I guess you were able to hear the last video pretty well. I didn't hear any screaming, and you couldn't, so.
Varroa destructor is an obligate parasite of honeybees with no alternative host, so the two have a close interrelationship. Here we represent the theoretical growth of a healthy colony without mite treatments in the Northern Hemisphere. In winter, colonies are typically comprised of all adult winter bees, shown here in dark blue, with very little worker brood, represented in light brown, and low varroa mite populations present on the adult bees. By late winter, the colony substantially increases its brood rearing, and the few surviving varroa mites invade cells for reproduction. As these new bees emerge in early spring, the colony expands rapidly in adult bees, shown in yellow, and brood. The colony commences rearing drone brood, represented in dark brown, which is preferentially invaded by varroa mites. Varroa mites reproduce during the cap brood stage of bee development, so potentially every 12 days in worker brood and every 15 days in drone brood, shown here by the red circles. In contrast, a honeybee colony typically only reproduces via swarming once per year, shown by the yellow circles. After swarm season, the bees stop rearing drones. Now all of the varroa are forced to reproduce in worker brood. If the colony experiences a midsummer nectar dearth, the brood nest contracts and varroa start to appear on adult bees. However, the majority of varroa are still hidden out of sight in the worker brood. It isn't until late summer, when both the bees and brood nest area have contracted, that we start to see varroa mite levels above treatment thresholds on our adult bee population. Late summer is also when colonies are rearing winter brood, represented in light blue. These emerge and become the long-lived winter bees, shown in dark blue. Winter bees have an extra layer of fat body, the organ varroa mites preferentially feed upon. As the colony stops rearing brood in the late fall, varroa are forced to exist on adult bees and have no place to reproduce. The mite population sinks accordingly, and we repeat the entire cycle once again.
That's Dr. Kirsten Trainer. And she came up with this nice paper that explains a number of things about disease. So if that wasn't bad enough, the other part of the paper, it gets into some interesting things. So if we look at it, we've got our 3 days over here, and that's where we've got our eggs being laid, and then they're going to hatch out. There could be larvae from that stage, and it's going to take several thousand visits to be able to turn them into pupae and then go on from there. Then the mite jumps in right here at the prepupal stage, and it sits there and hides out in the food until it gets capped. Then it lays an egg. That's going to be the deuteronymph, and that'll be the male. And then it lays another egg, and that'll be a female. And then they'll do some really weird stuff where they mate with each other, and then out comes 3 mites in the case of a worker. If we're talking about drone brood, out comes 4 mites. That's horrible numbers in terms of reproduction. When we start talking about control of varroa mites, we're trying to attack them right here. So everything that we have, with the exception of our fumigants, is a contact poison. It has to touch the mite to be able to kill it. So if we touch 90% of our mites, we kill 90% of our mites. 10% of them go in, and then we end up, out of 100, we'll say that 10 of them survive. That means in these 12-something days here, we're looking at 30 mites coming out. If they were all in drone brood, 40 mites coming out. Then we start all over again. Not great. On top of that, they do some weird stuff. They are vectors. They can transmit diseases, and that's not good. So the diseases are already there. They can increase the amounts, and then they're doing some nasty stuff from there. I'll talk more about it in a minute. So our bees have this nice little habit of being able to cannibalize what's going on. You might have heard of bald brood, and that's where they will actually rip the cappings off and begin to pull out the brood. And they will cannibalize them. They don't want to waste. They'll use that protein source, which means they're going to consume diseased tissues. And those are the same kinds of bees that are going to be nurse bees. So those nurse bees that consume diseased tissues are going to go feed other baby bees and then feed them diseased tissues and things like that. That's weird. And then who feeds the queen? Well, it's nurse bees and her retinue. So then, okay, now the queen gets sick. And then this can also be a sexually transmitted disease. So then we can see it getting transmitted from queen to drone. And then the queen can actually lay eggs that are actually covered in this stuff from there. So then this disease cycle can really spin up on top of that varroa cycle. That sounds pretty bad. I'm glad you're here for the bad news. I'll share this with you because it only gets worse. Most of the stuff I'm going to be talking about now comes from the Honeybee Health Coalition. So, hold on. I had this organized differently. No. That's not what I want to talk about. This is what I want to show you right here. So, yeah, give you a preview. That's probably good. We were probably running out of time for the rest of the slides. So, originally, what we thought was that the varroa mite was a vampire. I mean, it would basically feed on the hemolymph, the blood of the bees. And that was pretty bad. But that meant that it was not a problem in the winter. And as Dr. Trainer just explained to you, it's also a problem in the winter, and they're jerks about it. So then we thought that, okay, they only hitch a ride on bees. That's why we see them on bees. So then that's not that big of a deal. So then Dr. Ramsey said, I don't think that's what's really going on. Let me look into this. So there are 2 distinct phases. There's that foundress that goes in, lays that egg, weird stuff happens, and 3 mites come out. And then there's the dispersal phase. where we used to think they were riding bees, but it turns out that they take a snack, which is not good. So Dr. Ramsey said, all right, fine. People are finding mites on bees. Let's see how often that happens. So we look here, and this is where we typically think about finding mites on bees. That happens, in his case, less than 1% of the time. He had a pretty large sample size, so that's pretty good. Instead, it was almost 61% of the time we were finding them right here, we being scientists, in this case, Dr. Ramsey. That's weird. If they're hitching a ride, what are they doing there? Well, maybe they're in it to snuggle with those bees. They're just very nice, encouraging. They're thinking about snuggling up over winter. So here we are. He found one snuggling with a bee. Oh, look at it. It's snuggled underneath the sclerite, underneath the plate. That's not very kind. So then what's going on inside there? Let's remove the mite. And what he found was a hole. Oh, that doesn't sound like catching a ride. And a place where it glued itself in. Then you look inside and that hole has gotten nasty. These are scanning electron microscope pictures in case you're wondering. Because the mouth parts of the mite have penetrated into the bee and they started feeding on something. Well, that's not good. So, okay, let's check it out. I mentioned having a big wax moth problem. This is how I came to have a wax moth problem. This is the summer of 2017. I'd just been hired as new faculty and I was really working on teaching. I'd been messing with bees for quite some time and felt like the teaching part was going to be the biggest distraction for me. I'd really need to get under control. Somebody said, don't worry, we've got survivor stock. We've never treated. We've done this. We've done that. Oh, the bees will be great. It'll be fine. It's great. And that they blew smoke everywhere they possibly could. Is this a great looking brood pattern? It's not even brood, right? This is honey. Okay, great. So then what is this jerk over here? And another one over here. Hive beetles. That probably didn't help anything. So less than 1% of the time, we're going to find our mites right here. That's a lot of 1%. I zoomed in one day and I was able to count quite a few on here. That was pretty disgusting. So this apiary, by March, we had one of those Arctic blasts. I realized I'd moved too far north when we started to allow Canadians to name storms that came through. So anyway, that happened. And it challenged my bees in February, and by March, I cleared out all but one from this apiary. So that was quite a bit. That was a 99% loss. And that was disheartening to say. And that's how I ended up with a wax moth problem later on, because I had to keep working. This is not good. So just think of how many of those mites were actually hidden there. A lot of mites in that picture. Not good at all. So what were they doing? This is how complex things get. Let's not talk about pesticides yet. Hold on. Oh, okay. So what they were doing in there is they were actually feeding on the fat bodies of the bee. And the problem with feeding on the fat bodies of the bee, well, let me show you. This is the part that didn't come in quite like I wanted to. Let me show you. No, not that one either. Hold on. One more thing to pull up, and then I'll shut it down. We'll start getting quiet after a while. All right. Varroa life cycle. There's just so many presentations, so little time. All right. You all able to see this delightful mite here?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So let's see. This is all the bad stuff. Well, let's zoom out here. No. That's the same one. That's not what I was going for. This is what I was going for. Where did I explain it? Okay. This is it. This is what I wanted to show you. Sorry, this one didn't make it to the cut. Okay. This is the problem right here. This is, we were working 30 years in the wrong direction. 2019, this paper came out. A couple of us had listened to him before. He actually, in 2018, Dr. Ramsey came and talked to the Virginia State Beekeepers Association and talked about this work. They feed on fat bodies. That's what that organ is right there below where they're found 61% of the time is the fat body. And our overwintering bees have a boatload of fat bodies because they need it, because these fat bodies are central to fat and protein storage. Great, good. They're essential to immune response. So for them to be healthy bees, they need to have a good immune response. Well, if you eat the organ that does that, that's not going to work. So then this also really helps them out with thermoregulation. And what do we need our winter bees to be able to do again? Thermoregulate, keep themselves warm and keep their sisters warm. And then it gets into some interesting physiological things that are really pretty nerdy, like vitellogenins. You might have seen that pop up in some of the magazines. Those are going to be the precursors that help regulate worker behavioral shifts. So they impact the levels of juvenile hormone that build up over time that change workers working one area to another area to getting promoted, working outside of the nest until they eventually end up being foragers. So just from feeding on those bees, it skews all that stuff. Big cascading effects. And during the winter, they're not just a brood pest, they're an adult pest. They'll take a chomp out of one adult bee and they'll compromise that adult bee. And then they'll jump to another host, take a chomp out of that one. I mean, I'm oversimplifying it with the Pac-Man kind of analogy here, but they might as well be just stabbing them in the back. So they're slowly picking off our adult population that we work so hard to get going on. That would be pretty ugly if it weren't the only problem. The only problem, the other problems are that it was building up disease levels over the whole year. So if we waited till the fall to be able to then knock out this feeding problem, we have all these disease issues that are also there in the background. So then it's a 1-2 punch knocking our colonies out that they can't, as individuals, be able to respond to these things. And as a large group of individuals over time, that's our society, they end up picking it apart. So then we're left picking up the pieces in the spring. So the number one thing we can think about what's going on in our hives is thinking about preparing to not get taken advantage of. So how do we go about doing that? There you go. That was one thing. Sorry, that was one slide I had to jump through to be able to show you what was going on here. Let me wrap this up for you and we'll think about it in terms of a little bit of management stuff. So what can you do? How can you deal with it? We can look at the thresholds. When should you figure out how to treat? Well, you can look at the thresholds. So what are thresholds? Thresholds are looking at what's going on with some economic injury levels and things like that. Anyway, they tell us when this ends up being a problem. And so if we look at what our colony phase is, and this is from the Honeybee Health Coalition, right now I am in the population increase phase. Things are getting exponential in terms of brood and adult population. Then acceptable would be less than 1%. Danger would be somewhere greater than 2 to 3%. So in the 2 mite washes I did today with alcohol wash, it was 314 bees. The students got to count afterwards. I got 3 mites. So that is, you divide that by 3, and then that's going to be less than a 1% infestation. So somebody said, well, why would you wait to treat? Well, right now I would wait to treat because the option I have on the table is formic acid. I told you that most of what we have are contact poisons. You have to go and touch that mite to be able to kill it. Formic acid is kind of an interesting one in that it can penetrate the cappings. So in this case, I think I've got Mite Away quick strips lined up for the students so they can both do the install and the removal, the pre-treatment monitoring and the post-treatment monitoring to make sure it worked. And what I find is that I will be not breaking the overnight temperature low. So it's a fumigant, which means it's a volatile organic compound. It has to volatilize. It is temperature dependent. If it's going to be too cold overnight, the bees are going to cluster. They're not going to ventilate very much. And the Mite Away quick strip will not be at the right temperature to volatilize appropriately. The other end of the temperature thing in something like Mite Away quick strips and all of the other fumigants is an upper limit. So if it breaks, in this case, 85 degrees, then it begins to volatilize too much. So Mite Away quick strips, a 7-day treatment. If it gets above 85, I could be getting multiple days treatment in one day. And that is where it ends up being dangerous for our brood and dangerous for our queens. Not what we want. So one reason I'm not treating there. And if I'm getting this suboptimal treatment by using it at the wrong time, then I could be selecting for resistance. I could be wasting money. There's a number of reasons why we wouldn't want to do that. So we wait until the threshold. Now I think what will happen is by the time I sample most of the hives in the apiary this week, I'll probably find that something's over threshold and I'll have to treat the whole apiary because otherwise I have somebody making a bunch of mites. But maybe not. I don't have to treat. What I want to do is I want to make sure that I'm not encouraging disease pressure. So if I let my colonies just really develop a whole bunch of mites, then we can see that the disease levels can really pick up over time. And they're going to rise after the mite levels rise. And so then they're going to fall after the mite levels fall. So what I don't want is to have sick bees when the flow is on. I don't want to have a whole bunch of these other challenges going on when I need more from my bees. Let me see if I added this one thing that I wanted to show you. There's just so much I wanted to do. And then I was grilling a pork chop and I got a little distracted. So No, it didn't make it. Okay. The one thing I wanted to show you was about when we make our overwintering bees. So if we think about, we need to have the best bees possible. We need to have the best bees possible to overwinter. Excellent. Great. So then let's go backwards. Like we talked about in the beginning, let's go backwards, 21 days. So if our winter bees are made on average by the middle of September, which they typically are, then go backwards 21 days. Now we're talking about August. So then I need the bees that make my winter bees to be pretty healthy. Great. So then who made those winter bees? Well, some July bees. And we go back and back. At some level, when you all told me that there's no good time for my hives to get sick, there's no good time for me to let my hives tolerate being over threshold. The challenge for me is figuring out how to do all that management stuff and make that work and make that make sense. So I know that sounds like I'm asking a lot of you. And the QR code I'll post here in a second, well, can take you to this. But one of the things you can do is you can use this Varroa management decision tool. And it is 5 questions. These 5 questions will help you come up with what would be an appropriate treatment and when it would be an appropriate treatment. So then that will be things like, do your Varroa mite levels break threshold? How do you figure that out? You test. Are you open to synthetic organic treatments? Just pick whichever it is that works for you. Is your brood present? Because if your brood's present, then you're making more mites. Do you have honey supers on? That's important to know because you plan on feeding people honey. You want to make sure you're using appropriate stuff there. And then what's your colony's population level? Is it increasing, decreasing, dormant, with or without brood? Answer those 5 questions and it'll tell you what your options are. I know that's a lot, but the answers are there. The how it works is a little bit different. And the thing I find myself telling everybody is that you have to use what works for you. And I think until we can really knock down these mites taking out our hives, then talking about our overwintering successes and things like that is not really talking about, it's not being true to the conversation, really thinking about what's going on there. So that's a lot. Let me stop there and let me field some questions for you and give you all time to go because I know you're going to have your business meeting and things like that. So I appreciate your time. I didn't even show you the comic there at the end, but I've got one.
Well, we appreciate you. Hey, Mike, have you got any questions online you want to start with?
I was keeping it.
No, we can take questions from the audience there. We're monitoring the chat and there are no current questions.
There was a question about diatomaceous earth in small hive beetles, in bottom boards and things like that. And my answer was, you could certainly use it as a desiccant. It would scratch the surfaces of those beetles and dry them out over time. The #1 management recommendation for small hive beetles is have a good, strong colony and no place for those small hive beetles to hide. So it's kind of a challenge there because at some point, if you make your bees too angry, then they're not fun to work with. So back and forth there.
All right, I'm gonna throw a question in just to get us started. You know, toward the end when we were rushing you and you gave us that wonderful list of 5 questions to ask to help you figure out, okay, what do I do next? Okay, we've got our answers to all those questions. We haven't yet learned really a lot about all the various options for treatment that are available. Is there a shorthand cheat sheet somewhere that can help us take our answers and then find the right treatment?
Yes. So that is the Tools for Varroa Management Guide, and that is the Honeybee Health Coalition stuff. So let me quick share my screen and I will send you I'll share the QR code where you can see it. This QR code will take you to their website where you're going to find the Tools for Varroa Management Guide. If you're worried about foul brood, they have that. The new bee nutrition stuff's going on there. And it might sound like I'm advertising. The Honeybee Health Coalition has got a whole bunch of people involved and they take peer-reviewed science and make recommendations. And what they did was they started out working with these best management practices from the other folks and figuring out how beekeepers can come together and work with apple growers and make these recommendations. And I liked what they were doing so much that I actually got Virginia Cooperative Extension to become a member of it so I could continue to contribute to it because I think it is that good and useful of a resource. If you come to my talk, I have a print one to hand out to you.
All right then. And if you come to our class, we talk a lot about it too. We also promote the Honeybee Health Coalition, so, we're all together.
Excellent.
Other questions? Yeah. Jeff?
As far as integrated pest management, what are your thoughts on solid bottom boards versus screen bottom?
Sure. Now you're kind of spoiling what I'm going to talk about during my workshop, but that's okay. You can still come to my workshop if you haven't been to one yet. So
Two for
I
one.
talked about it. I talk about sort of what we were thinking for 30 years before that 2019 paper was the dumb mite theory. And so things like a screen bottom board, and the Tools for Row Management guide actually gets into this a little bit in terms of efficacy, would rely on the dumb mite theory. So if a mite's dumb enough to fall off, it falls through the screen bottom board, it won't make it back to its host. We did that for like 30 years, and now we still have this problem. So it's not the top of my list. It's not a problem unless you've got moisture control issues, things like that. Maybe you feel like it keeps your hive cleaner. Certainly an option. It is not a treatment, and it is not shown to prevent mite levels from building up.
How about if you have a screen bottom board and when you put the board in for the winter time to keep the air out, if you put a little bit diatomaceous earth on that, would that do anything to your bees, or could you get away with that?
So if you put diatomaceous earth in the bees, the diatomaceous earth just is crushed up diatoms. And that's all silica. That's the reflective stuff you'll see in the road signs and things like that when you all drive home tonight. If it gets on your bees, it could damage your bees. And so you just want to make sure that you're using it appropriately. I think Datant sells that IPM bottom board. That's what you're talking about. As long as things aren't getting swirled up into the hive, then it shouldn't really be a problem for your bees. We want to avoid your bees having to trench through it or anything like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like
So-
maybe murder sauce? Have any murder sauce? What?
So what was that?
Christie.
It's a video going around about using the DE called murder sauce. I don't know if you've come across that.
Murder sauce.
Murder sauce. Well, it's indiscriminate. You know, it can kill insects. It's something that I think my wife did some interesting research in it in public housing in Richmond, as a matter of fact, to prevent transfer of bed bugs through the wall void. Was if you put enough diatomaceous in there, it could kill the bed bugs. So there was a comment online from Bill. My 3 colonies survived the winter. 2 hives are very strong. My weak hive is currently in the top box, but the bottom box is, oh, wait, no, totally empty. I'm not sure what that means. Well, it means there's nothing going on upstairs. They were probably moving up, looking for more carbohydrate resources. So that probably means they need some honey. Top box has some brood and nurse bees, small number of foragers. Didn't see the queen, but it's evidence she's laying. You know, you could think about giving them a stimulative feed. It's something like a 1-to-1 sugar solution. So if there's not honey on, they could have the fuel that they need to go out and be successful. If you give them a pollen patty, then they could try and build up from there. Sometimes we can see that these bees are kind of recovering. These are our old bees. Ideally now with brood production, we have gotten rid of our old bees and we have all new bees. Some of the things we can see, like background diseases and stuff like nosema, can be an added thing that can slow down some of our buildup. So I usually think of some of our early season diagnostics as being stress diseases that we can try and relieve stress here and there to get out of. So if the stress is not enough fuel, if the stress is too much equipment, or if the stress is not enough protein, those are all things we can address. I hope that helps. Yep. Bill said thanks.
Right. Who else? Who else? Yes.
Do Russian bees or some of the other bred bees do a better job against varroa mites?
Yes and no, and it depends.
Thank you.
If you talk to a Russian queen breeder, then obviously they're the best thing ever. And
Yeah.
I am right now, I am working with the United States Department of Agriculture Research Service to get some pole line bees. And they're saying that the pole line bees, if kept the right way, keep the population of mites below threshold. That means, from a cultural control standpoint, you would not have to treat those hives. And I will go about analyzing this. I'm going to basically do a paired trial where I'm going to get a whole bunch of their queens, and I'm going to run a bunch of whatever mutt queens I've got and monitor both sets of colonies by the protocol that they have to just see how they do in making mites. And I hope that they're not good at making mites. That would be excellent, because so far in my career, I have not had a cultural control method. I'm using that term, so let me show you the pyramid of IPM real quick. So that's not totally out of context. See, I had all kinds of things up here for you all. Here we go. So a cultural control method would be something we would do early on, so you can keep resistant stock. I have not had access to a reliably resistant stock. So what I'm getting are artificially inseminated, if not mated queens in their closed mated system that should be able to exhibit the maximum amount of the behaviors that would prevent the varroa mite populations from building. And I have to familiarize myself with their exact terminology. And so what I'm basically doing is looking at it for you all, try and see how it goes, see how they do in Virginia. And USDA is excited to have me as a collaborator for that, because, hey, they have a line in Virginia. And if that turns out to be helpful, excellent. If it turns out not to be helpful, well, we're going to talk about that too, and maybe figure out why.
How long are you going to carry that? How many generations of bees are you going to be looking at?
Yeah, well, first I have to get the first generation. I don't know. And what I have to be careful is I have to make sure that I'm not violating my terms of use with them, and make sure I'm not like trying to breed queens and things from there. In a lot of these highly selective traits, we do find that when you get away from that initial full strength, that the strength does go down over time. But that'll be the one hive. I don't complain about making a whole bunch of drones.
Like that.
Maybe
Bad idea.
good stocks out there. I
Yeah,
suspect.
you want to bring some of those colonies down to the east end of Richmond, we'd be real happy. We'll make some drones.
Thank you for the invitation. First, I have to get them. So I'll be following back up on that. I'm basically trying to get as absolutely organized as possible to make sure I do this, put the top amount of energy in there to get the best result out of this. I'm excited. That right now, my back has been up against the wall. I practice what I preach. I can never be good enough at taking in notes, because usually it's the last line that says, bring a spare bottom board next time. It's the one that ends up being something helpful to act on once you break threshold. So I'm really trying to document everything and make it as absolutely careful as possible. But I get into this treatment zone where I break threshold, I treat. I break threshold again, I have to look at the next option. And I don't want to use the same thing over and over again, because that's how you repeat and end up selecting for resistance. And I found myself making a treatment last year I did not like at all. I hated this. And it said that this Honeybee Health Coalition and that Tools for Rural Management Guide said this is most effective when your colonies are brootless. And it said most effective. And so I said, all right, well, it's in the summer, maybe they're dropping down a little bit and things like that. So I was working with Zach Lamas out of Beltsville doing a drone sampling thing. And I was also running a paired sampling of my normal nurse bees to see what was going on for monitoring. And I was in the middle of a treatment and broke threshold, like way above threshold. And that was infuriating to me. So then I went back and made a cultural control method for my next apiary. I said, fine, this was my only other option I had because of how I answered those 5 questions. I forced myself to sit there on the hood of my truck, much like I did today when I emailed Mike back. I was gassing my truck up. And I went through those 5 questions and I had 2 options. So I'm using the second option because I'd already used the first. It was too hot to be using formic acid again. So I used this thing, and this one was hop card, and I was frustrated because I violated one of the assumptions, and that was I was making mites while trying to kill mites using a contact poison that has to touch mites. So that means any mite that's in the cappings is protected. So me being who I am, that was not going to be good enough. I went to my other apiary and put every one of my queens in timeout. I made a brood break. So then now I'd have no more protected mites. And it was a pretty big gamble. I was pretty scared about it. Hey, I'm going to take all these queens out of production, but I'm going to be able to fry some mites. And that was more effective. I basically took the assumption that I had been violating and eliminated that. but that took a pretty big gamble. So one of the challenges when I answer those 5 questions is I do have honey on, because I typically do 1 demonstration extraction a year just for the students. And that's, so I say the only way you can get Hokie honey is to take my class and extract it with me. That's all you can do. And so when the students leave, I do everything else instead of that. So this year I'm going to try and force myself to be able to do a mid-season extraction so I can answer that question differently and have more options available. But
It
then
helps.
it helps, but man, I'm really conservative about it, because I have had years where I've had a dry bloom or where goldenrod didn't bloom at all, and I've never had another chance. So I just need to put my faith in the power of thunderstorms and the weeds on the side of the road blooming. And it'll be nectar tomorrow. Ever the optimist, right? When we're beekeepers.
Yeah. Do you know how good it makes the rest of us feel to hear you say that? I'm really nervous about all this.
Well, I know, but I don't want you to think that I'm just sitting here and I've only got like 3 hives, and I'm not doing what I'm talking about. No, this 20 queens coming in will get me over 60 probably, and I'm gonna be jumping through every hoop I can. But if I don't break threshold, I don't break threshold. It'll be kind of, I'll have to watch my protocol, because if I'm going to treat the whole apiary, I probably won't be treating those bees. So I'll need to be on top of it. In case you're wondering what it takes, I think this one is capable of suppression of mite reproduction. So you have to go in and actually attack each individual cell within, like, the training level is to open up cap brood. It's like 800 cells that you go through, and you catalog every single stage of mite found inside there. So I'd have to do that for every one of these hives at least once a month.
Right. Yeah, that's totally called research, and you need graduate students to help.
Well, I won't have graduate students, but I have a fleet of undergraduate students, and actually I have 2 that are interested in undergrad research. And so my thought is, if this is going to be something we do once or twice a month, then I'm going to pay them to be there, pay them for this, and then drag them to a conference to talk about it afterwards. So we're going to get some utility about it.
That sounds great. Hey, I see number 6 on chat.
No more questions on chat.
Good. James, I can't believe that 2 hours have gone by.
Well,
You are just a wealth of knowledge. I know I've learned a lot just in this short amount of time. Do you have any comments you want to do before we wrap this up?
I don't. I'll talk about something totally different when we make our plans for our bee anatomy dissection kind of thing. And sounds like you will be interested in that. And then I will be sending out announcements about my varroa mite. Don't let varroa crash you. It'll be a lot of the similar stuff, but I'm going to take 3 hours then to talk about it, and then really explain some stuff out there. I appreciate your patience. I know I can talk too much, but I had a lot of thoughts I want to string together, and I hope that this will help you think about the proactive management to be able to be more successful in your overwintering success.
Well, we're going to tell you what we think about it right now. What do you think? Good job.
Outstanding.
Well, thank you very much. I'm gonna leave the meeting. I'm gonna stop recording, and I'm gonna leave the meeting, and I'll be able to turn it over to you, so you don't have to dump anybody from your rest of your group.
No worries, guys. I think what we're going to do actually is punt our business meeting. There isn't anything tragic that we needed to talk